Hello, this is Dr. Clark. This is Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology for Veterinary Technology. If you've gotten to this part, this means that you've actually successfully made it through the orientation modules to actually see this. And this is the correlated lecture that's going to go along with your basic Chapter 1. There's always the learning objectives at the beginning of all these PowerPoints. And these are going to be the same things that are going to be found in your book, so we're usually going to skip right over them. So, starting off with basically anatomy and physiology, it's very important to understand the difference between anatomy and physiology, and that's what this first slide goes over. So anatomy is always going to be the parts of the body, the forms, and the structure. So they're going to be things like your fingers, your hands, your nose, your ears. That's all a part of anatomy. Physiology is the actions of the body. So what actually are the functions? So like your hands, your fingers and your hand is the anatomy. The physiology is going to be actually making a fist. So the actual movement is going to be physiology, whereas anatomy is the structure. For your ears, it would be hearing. Hearing is going to be the physiology involved, or equilibrium and balance also comes from your ears. So that's the physiology. So the structure is the ears, the hearing, and the equilibrium is actually the function of the physiology, what it actually does, how it actually works. When we start looking at anatomy, there is what we call microscopic versus macroscopic. So macroscopic is anything that you can physically see with your eyes, and that's what's important to know, is that macroscopic you're going to see with your eyes. Microscopic, on the other hand, we're going to have to look through a microscope. So microscopic and microscope. Also, when we start looking at anatomy, we have regional anatomy, which is a specific area of the body. So all the anatomy on my arm right here, that would be regional. So looking at my fingers, my arm, my skin, and all that, that's a region. Systemic is going to be like the circulatory system. So that's going to be heart and all the blood vessels that go throughout the body. So that's the difference between regional and systemic. Real briefly, some planes of reference here, and there's a good photograph up on the screen. It's in your book too. We have several different reference planes that we look at across the body, and so the very first reference plane that we're going to talk about is the median plane. This is also known as the mid-sagittal, and this is actually what splits your right from your left. It runs right down the center of the body. So that's the median plane or the mid-sagittal plane. Off to the side, if we want to go a little bit to the right, we can have a right sagittal plane, which instead of going through the midline, we'll go through the right half of the body and split it in the right half into two. Or we could have a left sagittal plane, and that would split the body into on just the left half of the body. So there's a difference between sagittal and mid-sagittal there. We also have what we know as a transverse plane. Transverse plane is actually going to sit there and is actually going to cut the body in to front and back, what we also know as cranial and caudal. But it's going to cut the tail from the head right in the center of the body. Pretty much is going to divide the area that we'll get to talking about the abdomen and the thorax. Is pretty much where that transverse plane sits. There's also a dorsal plane, and dorsal plane is actually going to sit there, and it's actually going to take the back from the front. So it's going to actually run down the body this way right here, and it's going to take your back half, which is known as the dorsal half, from the ventral half, which is kind of your belly, your front side, your face. And so that dorsal plane is actually what separates your back from your belly. And so we talk on these planes when we're looking at specific areas of the body. Sometimes we'll have some of these planes that will actually be involved with limbs, and so you can actually have a transverse plane that's actually going to divide the limb from the lower half of the limb. So usually like on the forelimb on a person right here, the transverse plane is going to be right through your elbow, and so this is going to be what we call the distal end of the limb. This is going to be the proximal end of the limb. Distal meaning away, proximal meaning towards. So sometimes we will use some of these planes on limbs to describe specific areas. We have a whole bunch of directional terms that's very important to know. There's a whole list of them here. We're going to go through them really quick. It's very important for you to know your right hand from your left. And it's important to know that when you are looking at an animal, if you're facing forward of them, we talk about the animal side of the body. So if you're facing the animal, your right is not their right. Their right is going to actually be on your left. If you're facing the same direction the animal, so your face and their face is facing the same way, your right is going to end up being their right. So when we talk about the animal, we're talking about their right and left, not your right and left. So knowing your right from your left is very important. Cranial means towards the head, and caudal means towards the tail or towards the back feet. So that's cranial and caudal. When we're talking specifically about the head, we'll throw in an extra term, and that's rostral. That means towards the nose. So when we talk about the head itself, if you're already cranial, it's hard to be any more cranial. So we'll talk about rostral towards the end of the nose, and then once again caudal. And we'll use these terms to actually describe what direction that something's going to be in on the head. If we're looking at the back is always going to be dorsal. Just think of a dolphin with a dorsal fin. At the same time, ventral is going to be the belly or the bottom side. If we're looking at towards the middle of the body or that median plane, we call that medial. And if we're going away from the body, that's what we call lateral. So medial is going to be towards the median plane, and then lateral is going to be away from it. So a lot of times we'll use this to describe, say, on a forelimb. This would be the medial side. This right here would be the lateral side. If I'm looking at my body right here, this is medial, over here is lateral. If we're also looking a lot of times to figure out if something is deep or superficial, so deep is towards the inside of the body, so your heart is deep, it's in the middle. Superficial means on the surface or the outside, so like your skin is superficial. If we're looking at something that's going to be towards the body, it's called proximal. We especially use this on limbs to describe. Proximal is towards the body. Distal is going to be distant or away. So distal means distant and away. Proximal means in proximity, means close. So, my wrist is distal to my elbow. It's further away. Whereas my shoulder is proximal to my elbow. So if I actually look at my shoulder here, it's closer to my body than my elbow is. We also use terms called palmar and plantar when we actually look at the limbs and look specifically at the area that would be the paws or the hands. So the area where you're going to have the fingers at or the toes. So palmar is going to be the palm side. We actually call the top side of that dorsal. So there's palmar and there's dorsal when we actually look at the actual area of the paws on the animals or hands on people. On the feet, the part that you plant on the ground is what we call plantar on your feet. So on the hind limbs of animals, the part that's going to be in touch with the ground on their paws is going to be, or their hooves is going to be plantar, and once again the top is going to be called dorsal. We do have this thing called bilateral symmetry across the body. And so we kind of have a human example here. It shows where there's lateral. It shows some of the mid-sagittal, the median planes. In human, they use words anterior and posterior, superior and inferior. Superior means the same thing as cranial. Inferior means the same thing as caudal. Posterior means the same thing as dorsal. Anterior is going to mean the same thing as ventral. And so we'll actually see this sometimes accidentally used in veterinary medicine, but we prefer the terms cranial and caudal and dorsal and ventral. They're actually more correct than what the human terms superior and inferior are. But most animals, well, all animals and all people actually have equal symmetry on each side of the body. So there's equal halves. So it's very important to know that you should have one arm here on your right side and one arm on your left side. While there's only one nose on your face, it is symmetrical. You have two nostrils. You have two eyes. Even you can split your mouth. You only have one mouth, but There's equal sides between right and left, and it's very important to look at that symmetry. A lot of times this is how we know if there's something right or wrong with the animal. Some general plan of the overall body is one thing to know about is body cavities. So when we look at body cavities, there's two of these cavities, and the first one is what we call the dorsal body cavity, and that's because it's towards the back. And the dorsal cavity is going to hold the brain and spinal cord. So it's pretty much in the skull and runs down the spinal cord, and that's all it does in the dorsal cavity is it holds the brain and spinal cord. The ventral cavity is going to be below it, right next to the belly and the chest. And so you have one whole ventral cavity, and we actually split the ventral cavity into two parts. We have the thorax, which is going to contain the lungs and the heart, and then we're going to have the abdomen, which is going to contain the digestive organs, reproductive organs, and the urinary tract. And so this is actually going to be divided further by a muscle called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is what actually is going to divide the thorax, your lungs, and your heart from your abdominal viscera, which is your intestines, reproductive, and urinary organs. And so the dorsal cavity is just one big cavity that's going to hold the brain and spinal cord, and the ventral cavity is actually one large cavity that's split into two separate cavities, which are going to be the thorax and the abdomen. Basic levels of organizations. It's important to know that cells are the basic functional unit of animal life. So cell is the smallest thing within the body that can actually function and be alive. If we take a whole bunch of cells and we put them together and these cells are actually doing the exact same thing, that's what we actually call tissues. So like your skin, the top surface of your skin, the epithelium there is a tissue, and its main purpose is going to be to protect your body. And so what makes it a tissue is it's all the same type of cells, and they're all working together to make the same function. If we take a whole bunch of tissue and we actually put it together, and it functions as a unit together, then you have a whole organ group. So an organ would be something along the lines of like your small intestine. So its idea of it is to do a digestion and absorption of food products. And so that's one specific organ. It's one specific group of tissue that's going to sit there and work together for a common goal or a common interest in the body. An organ system would be like your whole digestive system. And so, you know, while your small intestine is a part of it, there's multiple organs that end up working together to accomplish the same goal. And so there's going to be things like your mouth and your tongue, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine, that are all going to be part of the digestive system, and they all work together. And there can be associated organs too, like the gallbladder, the liver, the pancreas. And so when we start looking at this level of organization, we always start off as cell. That's the small basic unit of functional life within the body. We put a whole bunch of cells together that are going to work and do the same thing. That makes a tissue. A whole bunch of tissues that work together in one specific area, you have an organ. And then you have a whole bunch of organs working together, and then you get an organ system. And when you put a whole bunch of organ systems together, then you get an organism. We are all organisms, and so therefore we're all made up of multiple organ systems that work and function together to keep us alive. Basically, one of the main things is health, and there's not actually a slide in here that kind of jumps to homeostasis, but health is a simple way of actually trying to keep normal anatomy and physiology of the body. And one way that the body actually does this is through homeostasis. And so homeostasis is this constant equilibrium that the body's doing. It's constantly trying to keep everything in balance. It's like a yin and a yang, if anybody knows the Chinese side of medicine and stuff. So for every action in the body, there should be an equal and opposite reaction. And it's trying to keep everything in balance like a scale. You're trying to keep everything on the level, and that's homeostasis. Do things in the body sometimes get a little bit out of level? Yes. And then the body tries to correct it and bring it right back into level. And so if we can maintain homeostasis, then we stay happy and healthy. If homeostasis stops, then that's when we have illness, and sometimes illness can potentially lead to death. So uh, that's pretty much the end of the PowerPoints here. The most important thing for you to do is to go ahead and do your pre-assessment quiz and then start working on your problem-based learning case. And I will see you in lab on Thursday. Hello, so this is Dr. Clark. This is for week 2 class, and this is going to start into chemistry and the chemical basis for life. So once again, like always, you're going to have and learning objectives right here, which are going to be the exact same ones that you already have in your book and already in your learning section, so we're going to skip over them. So this is pretty much going into basic chemistry. Some of you all might have this, some of you all might not. But we're going to be going just kind of through this week and then next week, so this is actually going to be split up between 2 weeks on chemistry and the basic chemistry for life. So one thing you have to know about scientifically here is that first off, there's physics. And so physics tells us how everything works in the universe. And from physics, we end up getting chemistry, which is how things actually hold together and actually make things up. And then from chemistry, we're actually able to build different materials for the body to use, such as sugars, proteins, nucleic acids, and that all takes chemistry. So basically, life and biology would not actually exist without either chemistry or physics. With that being said, we're going to start off with the very basic thing of chemistry, which is matter. So matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. So basically, the computer screen you're looking in front of you is matter. Your body itself is matter. And the table, the chair, all these different things are matter. Matter does exist in several different states. Matter can be the air around you. There's actually molecules. It's actually something physically that you touch. You might not actually be able to see all the little particles in the air around you, but it's still around there, and it's still matter is still within air. You have the liquid form, which is free-flowing. You have the solid form, which is very firm. There's actually a fourth form that's not in here, which is actually plasma, which is a state kind of in between a gas and a liquid. There's different elements that actually make up matter, and so we actually have what we call a periodic table, which tells us what these different elements are. And periodic table also tells you the weight. One thing that you'll look at up here on the periodic table is number 1 is hydrogen. It's in red. And usually things over on the, as you're looking at the periodic table, over on the left-hand side are usually the least stable. The most stable things are over on the right-hand side of the periodic table. So He over here on the top right-hand side is helium. Hydrogen is very flammable. Over here on the left-hand side, helium, on the other hand, is not. And so we have what we call the stable gases, which are things like helium, neon, argon, and these are all on the very right-hand side of the column. They have actually put in things like major elements, minor elements, and trace elements. These are things that the body actually needs. So the vast majority of your body is made up of hydrogen, which is H, carbon, which is C, nitrogen, which is N, oxygen, which is O. Other things that your body is going to need are things like sodium, which is Na, magnesium, which is Mg, potassium, which is K, calcium, which is Ca, phosphorus, which is P, sulfur, which is S, and chloride, which is Cl. And then in small amounts, your body needs things like iron, which is I, or zinc, which is Zn, or copper, which is Cu, or chromium, which is Cr. I take that back. I is iodine. Iron is actually Fe. Sorry about that. But Fe is going to be iron. So iron is very important for actually binding oxygen. So that's what this periodic table and the kind of the coloring means. But all these different elements that are listed on here are very important for actually making organisms and for life in general. And so 96% of all matter is found in a living organism, it's going to be one of these things right here, that it's going to be a major element, minor element, or a trace element. The other 4% is actually just space. When we look at matter itself, the smallest unit of an element of one of these chemicals we're talking about, being an oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, the smallest unit that retains the actual property of that element is what we call an atom. And so atoms are made up, and they're kind of all have the exact same shape. You're going to have a nucleus in the center, which is made up of smaller particles, and these are going to be made up of protons, which have a positive charge, and neutrons, which have a neutral charge. So in the nucleus you have protons and neutrons. Proton, positive. Neutron, neutral. And then you have an outer shell, which is made up of electrons, and all electrons have a negative charge. Electrons are very important because this is how we actually get chemical bonds formed, is through electrons. So we have what we call atoms that have ions, and so an ion is actually an atom that has actually lost or gained an electron. And by either losing or gaining an electron, it now has a charge. It's either going to have a positive charge or a negative charge. If you lose an electron, you have a positive charge. If you gain an electron, you have an extra negative charge, so you now have a negative. So one of the things that you're looking at right here is we have hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and one thing that we have is these outer shells. And so what makes a stable outer shell for hydrogen would be it actually having 2 electrons instead of just 1. One is trying to share. It's actually trying to get 2 into its outer shell. And that's what helium actually has. Helium is very stable. Helium is very hard to break apart because it has 2 electrons in the outer shell. When you look at carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, they have a further outer shell. And that outer shell is actually trying to get to 8. It wants to actually have, that outer shell is actually trying to get to the number 8. And so it's trying to get to having 8 electrons within the outer shell. And so a lot of times what will happen is something like oxygen will actually bind into carbon and will actually start sharing electrons to where oxygen can actually fill up its outer shell. And carbon can also fill up its outer shell. Carbon only has 4 electrons in its outer shell, and it's wanting to add another 4. Oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell, so it's trying to add 2 more. Nitrogen likes to bind up, and it has 5, so it's got binding spots for 3 more electrons in its outer shell. So it's trying to fill up that full outer shell. One thing we have is what we call isotopes. Isotopes we like because we can actually track a lot of different chemicals through isotopes. And isotopes are atoms that actually have a different number of neutrons within the nucleus of the atom. So on the inside, instead of having like nitrogen here, having 7 protons, 7 electrons, and 7 neutrons, an isotope of nitrogen might actually have 7 protons, 7 electrons, and maybe only 6 neutrons, or it might have 8 neutrons. And so that's what we call an isotope. It actually has a different number. So the electron shell, these little electrons are constantly moving, and actually everything's moving within an atom. It never sits still. So the protons, the neutrons actually are constantly moving within the nucleus, and then the electrons are constantly flying around at the speed of light around the outside of this atom. And so electrons that are in the shell closest to the nucleus in the first shell have a lower energy than the ones that are actually further out there in the second shell. And then some actually can have third and fourth shells of electrons around them, depending on how heavy. Something like uranium that has a really heavy molecular weight and is quite large. I think there's either 5 or 6 shells with electrons spinning around on the outside of it. So depending on what you're looking at is chemically is how many shells that you have. But hydrogen has 1. Oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, they're going to have the 2. And so the second one has much higher energy on the electron shell. And so you can see here where we have hydrogen, and it has the 1. It's lower energy. Helium has 2, and helium is what we call a stable gas. because its outer shell is actually filled with just two. Next you have lithium, which is actually quite volatile because it has two electrons on the inner shell and then only one on the outer shell, and it's at higher energy. And so lithium's constantly trying to look to bind to something to equal out its outer shell. It's trying to gain 7 more electrons. Carbon has 4. That's something that makes carbon very unique, is by having 4, it actually binds well with a lot of other elements. So it binds very easily to hydrogen, it binds very easily to oxygen, it binds very easily to sodium. Neon got an atomic number of 10. It has all of its electron shells filled, and so neon's actually another stable gas. It does not react very easily. Sodium, on the other hand, reacts quite violently because it only has one electron in that outer shell, and so it actually has 3 shells of electrons, and so it's trying to always level out that outer shell and trying to either lose and go down to just 2 shells instead of 3, or it's actually trying to actually gain 7 more electrons. So one thing that we have is molecules, and so molecules are where we actually have 2 or more atoms that are joined together that are sharing electrons. And molecules can be made up of 2 different elements, so like sodium and chloride down here below. Sometimes you'll have a molecule of sodium, and so it's actually sodium molecules that are actually sharing electrons between them. A compound is when you actually put 2 different elements together. And so a molecule of that compound it actually retains the properties of that compound, and it's the smallest unit. So in this case with sodium and chloride, it's the smallest unit is 1 atom of sodium and 1 atom of chloride. That makes up 1 molecule of the compound, and it will still keep the properties of salt, of sodium chloride. And you can actually see on the screen here how sodium gives up 1 of its electrons on that very 3rd outer shell to chloride, which has 7, and all chloride needs is 1 more electron to even out its outer shell. And so they now both have their outer shells even. So chloride has 8 in its outer shell, and now sodium has 8 in its outer shell, and so everything's stable when you put them together. We have some different types of bondings. There's the first one we're going to talk about is covalent bonding, and covalent bonding is actually the strongest bonds that are formed. We have single, double, and triple covalent bonds, and so this means a single covalent bond, there's only 1 electron being shared. A double covalent bond, there's 2 electrons being shared. A triple covalent bond, there's 3 electrons being shared. You'll find a lot of things like an atom of oxygen actually has a double bond where it's actually sharing 2 electrons between 2 atoms of oxygen, and that makes up a molecule of oxygen, which is why we call it O2. Nitrogen actually is called N2 in its stable form, and it's because it's got a triple covalent bond. It actually shares 3 electrons between 2 atoms of nitrogen, and that makes it stable. A lot of times we have single covalent bonds. So these electrons are actually being shared, and so this actually makes the strongest bond that there is possible. And this is the way that I kind of compare it to actually using like hammers and nails to actually put something, a board together to a table. So you're going to use glue and nails, so this is very strong, strongly put together, and actually to break that table apart after you use nails and glue in it takes a lot of energy. It takes the same thing to break down a covalent bond. It takes a lot of energy to break these things. Next up, we actually have what we call polar water molecules, which are actually covalently bonded. So hydrogen actually will borrow a electron from oxygen, and it'll, for a short period of time, have 2 electrons in its outer shell, and then oxygen will also steal hydrogen's electron back to fill out its outer shell to where it has 8. And so this is O2, and hydrogen. So they go together, and so you get H2O. So you have 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, and that ends up making water. One thing about it is oxygen is actually more greedy about the electrons, and so it actually does not like to share them with the hydrogen as much. So you actually, to water molecules, you actually have a slight charge. The oxygen side is more negative, and the hydrogen side is more positive, and so this actually comes to what we'll get to in a few minutes, which is a hydrogen bond. But one of the things about water is it ends up being, because of this uniqueness to the bonds between hydrogen and the oxygen, ends up making it a universal solvent. And at the same time, it allows water to flow and have surface tension, which is so important for life. So once again, you can actually see the positive and negative charge. Kind of already discussed that in the last one. Going forward, we have what we call ionic bonds, and so these ionic bonds are formed when electrons are transferred from one atom to another. So this is kind of the sodium and chloride. Sodium gives up that one electron in its outer shell, and chloride needs an electron, one more, to make from 7 to 8 in its outer shell. So sodium gives up one of its electrons and chloride gets it. So when you actually put sodium and chloride together and they form salt, the sodium ions or molecules actually have a more positive charge. The chloride atoms and molecules have a more negative charge. And they're definitely ionized because they have a positive and negative charge to them. This type of bond is more of a magnetic bond. So these bonds are much easier to break down. It's like putting two magnets together. It takes a lot less energy to break two magnets apart than it does to tear a table apart. And so a lot of times these things that have ionic bonds actually dissolve very well into water. So they're extremely soluble. Hydrogen bonds we kind of talked about briefly before is once again is this positive and negative charge. Since the hydrogens on water molecules have got a more positive charge, there's also a negative charge on the oxygen. There's these weak charges, and this actually helps to hold water molecules together. They don't drift apart. This is what gives surface tension. So this is what allows boats to float and ducks to swim. And the funny thing is that we can actually break down this magnetic charges through using things like detergents. So this is how detergents actually clean and work. It's actually break down this hydrogen bond. And when you do this, what happens is boats sink, ducks sink, things like that. This actually what allows the soap to actually, and detergent to actually penetrate inside your clothes and clean them. So this also works very well with things that have ionic bonds, like this is why salt will actually dissolve very easily within water. So that's why the oceans are salty, is that things that have ionic bonds dissolve very easily within water because of these hydrogen bonds. Chemical reactions. It's important to understand that we have 3 different types of chemical reactions. And this is going to be the way that we actually form new chemical bonds or we break new chemical bonds. And they require some type of an energy input or release. So we have what we call endothermic reactions, which means that it actually takes heat to actually cause chemical reactions. And we have exothermic chemical reaction, which means the chemical reaction actually gives off heat. So if you have something endothermic, it's actually going to require heat to make it happen. Exothermic, it's going to actually give off heat. When we actually look at chemical reactions, we have 3 different types. We have synthesis reactions, we have decomposition reactions, and exchange reactions. So synthesis reactions, these are reactions that are actually going to sit there and going to require energy to actually sit there and build and put something together. So this would be like taking an atom of oxygen and 2 atoms of hydrogen, and you actually can make water out of them by actually putting those together, and that's a synthesis reaction, and there is some energy involved in actually putting those things together. We also have what we call decomposition reactions, and so these are things where things are actually broken apart. So if you want to break water back into its elements, that can be done. You would actually break the bond, and it takes quite a bit of energy to actually break oxygen off of the 2 hydrogens, and so you can actually separate oxygen from the 2 hydrogens in water, and you can actually make water and hydrogen out of it. Exchange reactions, these actually take very little energy when we actually look at them. So with exchange reactions, a lot of times these are things where things are swapped out and there's actually very little energy that's involved in an exchange reaction. The main thing to know is that a lot of enzymes in the body actually do exchange reactions. So they actually cause chemical reactions to happen where there's very little energy input. But you usually have to have a catalyst or something that's actually going to help make an exchange reaction. Factors that influence reaction rates are going to be a concentration of reactants. So how many molecules or atoms of a specific element do you have, or of a specific chemical? temperature of the environment. So you can see this with like salt. Salt dissolves a lot easier in warm water than it does in cold water. Activation energy, so how much energy is going to require. So how much heat does this actually need for this reaction to go off? And then there's the catalyst, the exchange reaction. So this is actually where you actually have to have a chemical to make a reaction actually happen. There has to be another chemical. Or this can also be like in the body. A lot of times enzymes actually not only reduce the amount of energy to make a reaction happen, but they actually speed up the amount of time that it takes for a reaction to happen. So instead of a reaction taking, say, a minute to happen, if we use an enzyme or a catalyst, we can make it happen. Instead of a minute, we can make it happen within a second. Kind of going into inorganic and organic compounds. Inorganic molecules, these are things that do not contain carbon, or hydrocarbon groups. So these are going to be things like water, salts, acids, some bases. Some acids and bases in the body do actually have hydrocarbon groups, but there's just a few of them. But for the most part, it's water, salts, and some of our acids and some of our bases. And the main thing with inorganic molecules is, once again, they lack carbon. So carbon is a very key thing as far as inorganic molecules go. Organic molecules, on the other hand, they all have carbon. Water is a very important thing to have for life because it's a universal solvent. It actually allows salts, acids, bases, different things to actually be dissolved that keep life going. They actually allow for exchanges of gases with things like oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so a lot of things are what we call hydrophilic. They actually like and dissolve and mix well in water. At the same time, there are things that are hydrophobic, which are chemicals that they do not dissolve in water. So a lot of your oils and a lot of your lipids and your fats are hydrophobic. They will not dissolve in water. So this is why things like oil and water don't mix. So if you actually try to mix them together, oils have a lot of lipids in them and they're hydrophobic. They will not mix in water. One thing about water is it actually flows, and so it's the ideal transport medium. So this actually makes up the majority of the fluid in your bloodstream is going to end up being water. And because of water's transport capabilities, it allows cells, fats, and proteins to actually be moved from one part of the body to the other. The other thing it has is this high ability to actually take up heat. So it can actually do a lot as far as absorbing heat that's given off inside the body through digestion and other chemical reactions. And it is a great lubricant. It actually keeps everything well lubricated and slicked and moving along. And we kind of look at some of the different things that in the body as far as what dissolves in water and what the body's made up of. One of the main things is salts, and so salts are actually mineral compounds. They're going to be things like sodium chloride, magnesium, phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, all these different things that if you look back at your periodic table are actually going to sit there, and they were going to be called some of your major elements or minor elements, excuse me, some of your minor elements are a lot of these salts. And so these are going to make up the bone. They're going to make up a lot of the components within the cellular fluid, within the bloodstream. And so these are very important for actually a lot of the reactions and what happens in the body. When salts are added to water, they immediately ionize, so they actually break up. Water actually breaks them up instead of being formed together in a solid block like this with salt, with sodium chloride, where they're all packed sodium and chloride tight together. You put them in water, and the electrical bonds within the water, those hydrogen bonds automatically start splitting them up, and that's what actually allows them to dissolve. And so when we actually dissolve them into water, these salts, we actually end up calling them electrolytes, and we actually measure them in the body. We actually do what we call electrolyte panels. Acids and bases, these things actually only occur where there's water. So to have an acid or a base, you have to have water. Acids release hydrogen ions. Bases release hydroxyl ion. Acids have a low number pH. Bases have a high number pH. A lot of times acids and bases are also considered electrolytes within the body because they specifically dissolve and break down within water. So we do have a pH scale, and so this is very important to know. Neutral is considered 7 on the pH scale. The smaller the number goes, the more acidic something is. So something with a pH of 1, like gastric fluid or hydrochloric acid, is highly acidic. And so 7 is neutral in the middle. So something with a pH of 12 is extremely basic, like ammonia. Something with a pH of like 1, like hydrochloric acid, is extremely acidic. Perfectly distilled deionized water is neutral at 7. So there is no acid, there is no base, it's right in the middle. And the body, for the most part, tries to keep itself right there in neutral at 7. When you add up all the acids and all the bases in the body, they actually add up to be, the body actually ends up being perfectly neutral at 7. Buffers, these are actually weak acids and bases. They don't completely ionize in water. And one of the things about them is they actually help to maintain that pH in that neutral range of 7. And so there's actually a whole buffer system in the body. We'll actually get into this in AMP2 and once again in vet nursing and anesthesia and surgery over at the whole acid-base system in the body and the importance of buffers. And so we'll actually pick up next week at organic and inorganic compounds.